and welcome to State of the Economy, a show that will bring you a ringside view of policy making at the highest level. Today we have with us Dr. Rangarajan, Chairman of Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, who will help us understand where the Indian economy is headed in 2012. Dr. Rangarajan needs no introduction. As you all know, he's worked on every aspect of policy making since 1991 when India introduced economic reforms. He's worked closely with Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, who was then Finance Minister. He's been Governor of RBI, he's headed finance commissions, he's headed several other important committees and commissions, and knows how Indian policy has evolved over the last 20 years. Welcome to Rajya Sabha TV, Dr. Rangarajan. I would like to start with your view on where is India headed in 2012, given the backdrop of gloom in the global economy, which is impacting India, which we all concede is impacting India. And where do you think India needs to bring about important changes in its domestically driven policy?
2011 has not been a good year, either for the world or for India. Growth has slowed down in almost every country. The growth rate in the advanced countries is put now at about 1.5 to 1.7%. That's a very low growth rate. Europe is in fact facing a severe crisis. The United States seems to be in a little better situation. Growth rate has slowed down in India also. This is partly due to the external factors and partly due to domestic factors. At this point, we do not know very clearly what the growth rate in the current year will be. But I guess it will be somewhere between 7 and 7.25%. As we look ahead, in 2012, once again, it is very difficult to predict where the growth rate will lie. I think that perhaps the growth rate for India will be somewhere around 7.5% to 8%. This will all depend upon how the world shapes in 2012 and how some of the domestic factors will also operate as far as India is concerned.
So global factors, as you said, sir, are not in our control. What are the domestic issues that India needs to urgently resolve to get a 7 to 7.5% growth that you're talking about? Because the general view is that because of various political factors, political economy factors, we have not been able to drive policy decisions in India, which people describe as policy paralysis or lack of decisions in the government. Do you think 2012 will be different in that respect?
I think some of the negative factors that have operated during 2011 may not be there in 2012. I do not entirely accept the proposition that the policy decisions have not been fast enough. Efforts have been made to introduce certain policy reforms. However, policy changes which required legislative approval have had a setback because of the numerical strength of the party in power in the parliament. But otherwise, I personally believe that the policy environment has not in any way deteriorated from what it prevailed earlier. For example, under the same policy regime, we have been able to grow at a rate exceeding 9% for 3 consecutive years starting 2005-06. I do not see a deterioration in the policy environment since then. I entirely agree that we could have taken certain other initiatives which could have pushed the reform agenda a little further. But I think the efforts, for example, to clear the doubts regarding land acquisition by introducing the new bill on the subject is a good initiative. And perhaps this might get passed during 2012. And therefore, one irritating factor can be removed during 2012. But you are asking me more precisely to say what can be done which can make a difference in 2012. I personally believe that in this situation, where the investment sentiment, particularly in the private sector, is weak, what really needs to be done is for the government to take the initiative.
Yeah.
I would say that in the public sector must fulfill the targets set for production and capacity creation. Take, for example, the energy sector, more particularly the power sector. While we have done well in 2011 as compared to the previous years, we have nevertheless fallen short of the target. Therefore, whether it is coal or power, which are the driving forces in the economy, we must fulfill the output targets and the capacity creation targets. This may itself act as a stimulus for private investment.
So this brings me to the next, the big paradox. The economy, everybody concedes there's pent-up demand for infrastructure, for roads, for ports, for power. Yet, why is it that mining showing negative growth? The latest data shows mining as a negative. Why is India's coal production is not going up when you need coal-fired power? What is this paradox?
Well, I think it is really a managerial problem. In the case of coal, for example, we had 3 successive months of decline in coal production. But latest numbers indicate in November there was an improvement, and perhaps there has been an improvement in December also. There is really no lack of policy, let me say, which is responsible for the decline in production in coal. I regard that pure and simple a managerial problem, a governance problem, and I think if sufficient effort is directed towards achieving the target, it can be done.
So are you saying that when you say lack of managerial problem, are you saying that those in charge of pushing for more coal mining are not taking decisions fast enough?
Well, I am saying that the whole area of managerial decision making
has to
improve in this particular area so that we can do it. To some extent, of course, we know that in the case of coal, the Singareni colliers were affected because of the Telangana agitation. But that does not fully explain the decline in coal production. And therefore, I would say that in the case of coal, effort required to fulfill the target is important. And that also ties in with the capacity creation in the power sector. If adequate coal linkage is not promised, then there is no incentive to add capacity in the power sector.
So it's time for a small break now. Keep watching Rajya Sabha TV. Welcome back. We are discussing state of the economy with Dr. C. Rangarajan. So, there is this new theory which people are subscribing to, which is that a 9% growth cannot be sustained with high inflation. World over, history suggests that with high inflation, growth can be sustained only for 2 or 3 years. After that, growth starts tapering off. Now, how serious is inflation as a threat to growth in our current trajectory?
What is the potential rate of growth of the Indian economy? If you want to arrive at some number, one needs to look at the macroeconomic parameters relating to savings and investment. We have had a savings rate a few years ago when it touched 36%, 34%.
Investment rate had touched about 37%.
Investment rate had exceeded 36%. Even with an incremental capital output ratio of 4:1, it should give us a 9% rate of growth. Therefore, I have always regarded 9% rate of growth as the potential rate of growth of the economy. But many things can happen which can prevent us from achieving this potential. Certainly, the Indian economy has the wherewithal to grow between 8 and 9% comfortably. But there are other factors that might come in the way of achieving this potential. I will not elaborate on that because I will come back to the precise point that you have raised. One issue certainly is, one macroeconomic concern I will certainly say is the high level of inflation. I do not subscribe to the idea that high growth rate warrants high inflation. In fact, if you look at our own recent history, in the 3 years when we grew at a rate exceeding 9% per annum, the inflation rate was not that high. Yeah. In fact, the inflation rate has shot up only during the period when the growth rate has somewhat slowed down from that very high growth rate. Therefore, I do not endorse the view that high growth rate warrants high inflation. In fact, if high inflation persisting for a long time or for some years can come in the way of our achieving a high growth rate also. In fact, the only occasion on which a high growth rate can cause inflation is a situation when the growth rate exceeds the potential and it results in what we normally call as overheating. In that situation, certainly inflation can be the consequence of high growth. But we are now talking of a situation in which we have not crossed the potential rate of growth of the economy. Therefore, I will say that in order to achieve and sustain a high rate of growth in the economy, we must bring inflation down as fast as possible and keep it at a lower level in the range of 4 to 5%.
But there is also a view that we are not able to achieve our potential rate of output growth, which is, as you said, 8 to 9%, because there are huge supply bottlenecks which are stuck in governance issues. As you earlier said, we are not producing, our mining sector is growing at 0% today. We are not producing enough extra coal, enough extra iron ore, enough extra other mining in other mining sector. And this problem we've also had with food. If you look at the long-term trend of agriculture production. So how much do you think are these supply factors actually not letting us achieve the potential rate of growth?
Correctly. I think you have clearly identified some sectors which can act as a barrier to achieving the potential rate of growth of the economy. I would identify two sectors. One, which you have indicated, is agriculture. The other is the infrastructure, and within infrastructure, more particularly power. The last 2 years have clearly shown how even a small shortfall in agricultural production can cause serious distortions in the economy. From the point of view of food security, from the point of view of balanced regional development, from the point of view of reducing poverty, we need to ensure that agriculture and allied activities grow at an annual rate of 4%. And that, I think, we must ensure. The second area is what we have been talking about is infrastructure and more particularly power. The non-availability of power has acted as a constraint on growth in many of the states. Many of the states today suffer from a deficiency to the extent of 7 to 10%. Now that is a serious problem, and that is also linked to what you indicated, namely the availability of coal and so on. The generation of power is very closely linked to the availability of coal, and if coal is not available, power is also not.
Much of our power is coal-driven.
Right. Therefore, there is the close link, but there are other factors also in relation to power which we need to address. Availability of land is important in the case of capacity creation. Environmental issues are also relevant in terms of adding more capacity in power. But if in the 12th plan, that is in the next 5 years, we focus attention on agriculture and on infrastructure and more particularly power, we might be able to achieve the potential rate of growth of 8 to 9%.
And sir, how far do you think is inflation getting imported from the huge surge in liquidity which started with America, with the US after 2008? Because data shows that after quantitative easing, after QE1, which US administered, commodity prices went up by about 60%. And after QE2, commodity prices, including oil, went up by 45%. So do you think this is also a threat to growth in India and emerging markets?
Well, to the extent to which international commodity prices rise, it has an impact upon domestic prices, and overall inflation can be affected by it. But I would say that there are two factors operating in the international scene. One is the larger availability of liquidity, and therefore the financialization of the commodity markets, as some people call it, which result in the commodity prices going up. But on the other hand, since the economies are not growing fast, there is less of a demand for the products. Therefore, there are two factors operating: one to push up the prices, the other to slow down the prices. While some of the international commodity prices have gone up, in the more recent period, even crude oil prices have remained at that high level, have not risen further. But I would say that when you look at the domestic inflation, the factors or the responsibility of the external factors is not very significant. I think that the inflation in India has largely been driven by domestic factors.
So it's time for a small break again. Keep watching Raj Sabha TV. Welcome back. We are discussing state of the economy with Dr. C. Rangarajan. So you were talking about how the global situation, commodity prices, etc., are impacting the Indian economy. But as you said, domestic factors have been more responsible for driving inflation, at least. So now I want to come back to the fiscal situation. Given the way oil prices have been going up and are still fairly up, how is it impacting India's fisc? Fertilizer subsidy, oil subsidies, all together, put together, they are way beyond the budgeted target. And it is widely being speculated that the fiscal deficit will overshoot the target by at least 1% of GDP or even more. So do you have fiscal room this time? Like you had after 2008, you had enough fiscal room to drive various entitlement programs, social sector programs. But do you have enough fiscal room this time to keep going on that trajectory? Do you think if we expand our fisc, it'll again impact growth?
No, the scope for fiscal stimulus to energize the economy is somewhat limited now. We had greater maneuverability, as you said, in 2008. At that time, the fiscal deficit was coming very close to the target fixed in the FRBM Act. Yeah. But then, because of the fiscal stimulus, it went up very high. So we had 2 years in which the centre's fiscal deficit alone exceeded 6% of the GDP. Certainly, the international commodity prices, more particularly the crude oil prices, have an impact upon the subsidies that will have to be made available to the oil marketing companies if the retail prices are not altered. I think the lesson from the current experience is that we should really move fast towards dismantling the administered price structure in a fundamental sense as far as petroleum products are concerned. We cannot afford to have these level of government subsidies. But you will note in the current year, while the under recoveries of the oil marketing companies have been rising, the government itself have not yet increased the subsidies made available to the oil marketing companies. In fact, the fiscal deficit will shoot up even higher once those subsidies are made available to the oil marketing companies. I think the time has come to take a serious view on what we do about petroleum subsidies and fertilizer subsidies. I say this also in the context that the new food security bill, once passed, will also impose an additional burden in terms of subsidies as far as the government of India is concerned. And therefore, if we think that food security is a primary concern, then it becomes necessary to ensure that the subsidies under other heads are brought down more steeply in order to accommodate the higher subsidies under food security.
So, coming back to the food security bill, isn't it true that the food security bill can be implemented even if it is passed by Parliament only next year when the actual number of the poor under the socio-economic and caste survey is determined? So, isn't the actual burden, the fiscal burden of food security about 1 or 2 years away?
No, I think the food security bill will come into operation in one way or the other in the next fiscal. It may not be at the beginning of the year, but it could be very well be in the middle of the year or even from beginning the second quarter of the fiscal. Because the survey is already on the way, and therefore by March, April, I expect the survey to be completed, and then a decision will have to be taken based on the survey, how many people should be declared as being in the preferred category and how many people are in the general category. Therefore, the food security bill, in my view, will become operational next fiscal.
So, quite aside from the food security bill imposing extra burden on the fisc, the logistics of it also seems very daunting to me because you will be procuring, your average procurement in the last, say, 6-7 years has been about 35 million tons, 40 million tons. You have to procure another 25 million tons to reach about 60-65. Do you have enough domestic production to procure that kind of extra food grains, or will you have to depend on imports? Are these logistical factors being considered?
I don't think we need to depend on imports. At the present moment, we are procuring more or less 50% of the marketable surplus. The highest that we have achieved in the recent period is somewhere around 50 to 55 million tons. That we have shown that we can procure. But the requirement under the food security bill, when it becomes an act, will be even more than 55 million tons. Therefore, we will have to procure more. Now, this additional procurement will have to come not only from the existing regions, but also from the regions from which we have not been procuring so far any sizable quantity. I think the food procurement system must become much wider than what it is now. Therefore, there is the issue of what needs to be done in order to procure more and what needs to be done in order to store more of what is procured.
So those are the logistical issues that you have
those are the issues that will have to be addressed.
So, and one more thing, coming back to some of the macro issues, do you think it's time for an interest rate cut, considering that food inflation is now down to virtually 0.4% as reported last week? So, do you think the interest rate cycle needs to now move downwards to give a push to growth?
Well, I think some indication was given by the Monetary Authority, the Reserve Bank of India, even in the last policy statement. They had indicated that after giving a pass, that it might be possible for them to reverse the present stance once there are definite signs of decline in inflation. So we shall wait for the December numbers to come. That will come in the middle of January. Once those numbers indicate a very definite decline in prices, perhaps that may be the appropriate time to do it.
And so, what about the rupee? A lot of concern has been expressed about the sharp depreciation of the rupee, nearly about 20% in the last 6 months. Do you think it's a fair value? Rupees is that fair value today, or what's your view?
Well, you see, in a situation in which the capital flows also dominate the balance of payments, the value of the currency, any currency for that matter, is not determined only by the current account of the balance of payments. The current account of the balance of payments taken in conjunction with the capital flows determine really the value of the rupee.
So now, you're saying once capital flows resume, the rupee would...
Therefore, I am saying that the present pressure on the rupee is the result is because of the mismatch between current account deficit and the capital flows. And in the last quarter, that is the quarter ending December 2011, the capital flows have been very modest, whereas the current account deficit has been probably running at the same level as it was last year, and therefore there is a mismatch which has led to the depreciation of the rupee.
So you're saying that once capital flows normalize, the correction will also come about.
Therefore, it is my view that there will be a correction in the value of the rupee once the capital flows resume.
Thank you, sir. That is all we have for this edition of State of the Economy. Be with us and we'll bring another policymaker next time to discuss State of the Economy. Thank you.